Whew. Hey y'all, how's it going? Welcome back to Seed to Plate channel. My name is Brooke, and this is the place we talk about all things urban and suburban gardening. Today we're at my community plot. There is downtown Austin, and today was Determinate tomato planting day. So I want to give you all of my best tips for success on starting your tomatoes and planting them, whether you have them from transplants from the nursery or you actually grow them from seed. So let's get started. Now, if you saw my video earlier this week, it was more of like a video diary about planting for the spring. So I have all of my Indeterminate tomatoes at my home garden, and I have all of my Determinate tomatoes at my community plot. So first things first, the difference between Determinate and Indeterminate. So Indeterminate tomatoes are going to be your really special heirloom varieties, your big slicers, your very unique varieties, but the biggest differentiator, well, the differentiator between Indeterminate and Determinate is that Indeterminate will keep growing. They have an indeterminate height. They will just keep growing and growing until they freeze or you stop supporting them and they fall over, which is kind of what happened to me last year. My Indeterminate tomatoes got about what I called 2 brooks tall. So they were around 10 feet tall, probably more like 9, but they felt like 10 feet tall to me. So your Indeterminate tomatoes will just keep growing and growing, and the fruit comes as the tomato plant grows. Determinate tomatoes, on the other hand, have a determined height and a determined number of fruit that the tomato plant will actually set. So Determinate tomatoes are really, really good for getting a bunch of tomatoes at once for the purpose of canning tomato sauce, which is my plan for these Determinate tomatoes this year. I got a lot of my Determinate tomato seeds from a garden friend, but I'm growing 4 different varieties. So there's San Marzano, which is a Roma type, actual just Romas, and then I have Red Snapper and Invincible, and those are the 4 types of Determinate tomatoes I'm growing. Now the Romas and the San Marzanos are kind of like semi-determinate. I've grown both of those varieties before, and basically what happens is you get like 6 fruits at a time. So if you're growing multiple plants, you end up with enough to make sauce, but that's kind of how those go. That's the difference between Determinate and Indeterminate. You probably want to actually see a tomato since you've only seen my face so far in this video. Here is one of our little toms. So one of the things with spacing tomatoes, if you want to give them plenty of room, so this is a 4 foot by 4 foot bed, and I have 4 tomatoes in here. Now, I put them really in the corners so their roots will spread to these surrounding areas and they won't compete for any kind of nutrition. Same thing here. This is an 8 foot by 4 foot bed, and same thing here. I put them pretty far apart. And then finally the last bed. So tomatoes definitely need a lot of room to grow. That's how I say it. They just need a lot of space to be a tomato, which is fine. I need a lot of space in my life to be a Brooke. But the thing with tomatoes is they have really deep root systems, which is pretty much why you want to plant them so far apart. But also you want to plant them super, super deep. And the biggest reason to plant them super deep is for water conservation, especially if you live in a hot climate like I do, but also to establish their root system. So if you see all those tiny little hairs on the tomato stem, because of the lighting it looks a little bit weird. But if you really look, it has all those little hairs. Those all hairs will become roots down in the ground. So this tomato was probably at least twice as high when I put it in the ground. So I always dig a really, really deep hole when I plant my tomatoes. Okay, so we've talked about spacing. We've talked about depth. You want to plant your tomatoes really deep. So what about compost and fertilizer? So this year I'm using this MicroLife multi-purpose fertilizer. Now this is completely organic. It's made from a bunch of organic stuff, but I sprinkled this on the top of the soil. Some people will put a handful of compost in the hole before they put their tomato in. Everybody has their trick. I've even heard of people putting a whole egg in the ground with the tomato, and that is to solve a calcium deficiency, which can cause blossom end rot. I don't really know how effective it is, to be honest. It's never something that I've done, but I know that people do it. Some very successful tomato growers do it. So in terms of fertilizer or compost, you can throw some compost in the hole. I didn't feel the need to do that because where these tomatoes are planted has not been growing anything for a while. I actually took over half a plot next to my actual plot. This is my actual plot with potatoes, garlic and onions. So with fertilizer, that's what I chose to do, and that fertilizer will release slowly over time. The biggest thing with fertilizer and tomatoes is going to be your nitrogen, especially at first. Tomatoes are really, really heavy nitrogen seekers. So if you don't want to use an organic fertilizer, then you can use something like composted cow manure or anything else that's really, really high in nitrogen specifically. Now they will also need a good amount of calcium, and that's to prevent blossom end rot, which blossom end rot is what happens to the tomatoes. You get a rotten spot right on the bottom of the tomato because the blossom never completely fell off. And that's something that happens a lot here in Texas because it's so humid. If you're in a drier climate, it's probably not quite as likely to happen. So the other thing with tomatoes is you want to water them in really deeply and also mulch them. So for this plot specifically, I watered before I mulched because the dirt was so dry that I could actually dig into it with just my hand. I didn't really need a shovel. So we needed to get that root system really nice and damp. And so I went ahead and watered, and then I put mulch on. Now, the thing with mulch is it's gonna be really good for water conservation. Tomatoes do not like to be watered every single day. Tomatoes like to be watered infrequently, but really deeply. So it's okay if you like soak things a little bit. That's totally fine. And any kind of like wood grain mulch, pine mulch, straw mulch, any kind of mulch will work. Just make sure you're not using dyed mulch. Dyed mulch is not good. The last thing to talk about, which isn't super relevant right when you plant tomatoes, but it will be relevant pretty soon because tomatoes grow really fast in the right conditions, is going to be some kind of support system. So I have these cages right now. Cages are very expensive for the amount of tomatoes that I grow. So I'm gonna do a whole video on trellising or supporting tomatoes because there's a million different ways to do it. A ton of different people like to do it a ton of different ways. But a cage, if you only have like 1 or 2 tomatoes, a cage is a great option. Just remember, if you have indeterminate tomatoes, they may very quickly outgrow their cage, which is exactly what happens to me, which is why I don't really love to use tomato cages, the traditional metal ones. Okay, y'all, I know it's not the best lighting and it's definitely not the best angle, but it's the best place I have to put my camera. So I am done planting out all my tomatoes. I think I have about 27 varieties, and individually I have upwards of 50 tomato plants. So I will continue to make plenty of tomato videos, but tomato planting season is upon us, and I hope it is successful for you. So thank you so much for watching. Happy gardening. Please leave any questions or comments or helpful tips. I would love to hear about how you plant your tomatoes. I have a ton of like sage OG gardeners in the comment section all the time, always giving the best advice. So drop your comments in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching. Happy gardening, and we'll see you next time.